Our subject tonight is April 17, 1861 to Appomattox and beyond. And as we continue through the program, you will know why that's the title for tonight's talk. Now first I'll give you a bit of history at Forest Hill. What we call Memorial Day was originally Decoration Day. It was begun by Southern women who were decorating the graves of their deceased soldiers who had served in the Civil War. When a formal declaration was made on Decoration Day, it was proclaimed by Union General John Logan. There is an organization today, some of its members are local men, and it is called the Confederation of Union Generals. Now, these are reenactors. They are more or less headquartered in Gettysburg, but we have a man that's buried at Forest Hill Cemetery who portrayed at one time General John Blackjack Logan, and his name is Ray Solder. Now let's think a little bit about the Veteran Soldiers Association. The Veteran Soldiers, or the VSA they were called, were organized prior to there being any GAR posts here and elsewhere. GAR, of course, we don't need that because it doesn't have anything to do with anything. The GAR means the Grand Army of the Republic. And when the original piece of ground at Forest Hill that was sold to the Veteran Soldiers Association for $1 was filled, they needed more room. And so additional land was added by the cemetery to that section. In the original part, it was for soldiers only. In the additional part, wives could be buried next to their husbands. So whichever one died first, the grave next would be reserved for the surviving spouse. This section, like I said, was sold to the VSA by the Forest Hill Cemetery for $1 in May of 1878. On the 28th of May of that year, there was a reburial service held for soldiers who had originally been buried in the old Pine Brook Cemetery in Scranton, which is no longer in existence. Some of these soldiers, these reburials, were actually deaths from the Civil War. Some were soldiers who died after having come home. 9 soldiers, including 2 unknowns, were reburied that day. Also buried with their father were 4 children who had been buried in Pine Brook Cemetery. They're in their father's grave, and special permission was given to their mother and the wife of the soldier for that by both the VSA and Forest Hill. And then 4 years later, there were actually 2 more veterans who were reburied again from Pine Brook. These 2 sections, and I always have a habit of referring to it as the old soldiers section. But in those 2 sections, which adjoin one another, there are 78 Civil War veterans buried in those sections. There are a handful of other veterans who are buried in single graves throughout the cemetery. But the majority of Forest Hill's 380 Civil War veterans are buried through the cemetery on their family lots with other family. Some of these have their own personal tombstones, and some of them do have the military markers. Now, in the old soldier section, they all have the old original upright marble, white marble, government markers. But most of them, the ones that are buried on their family lots, there aren't too many of them. who actually have a government marker. They have a marker that matches everybody else on the lot. We have brothers, cousins, in-laws, fathers and sons, young and not so young, local and some from as far away as Colorado. We have blacks and whites, we have native-born and we have foreign-born, farmers to professionals, POWs, injured in the war, died in the war. We have the world's youngest telegrapher, we have signal corps, we have construction crews, we have the Secret Service, we have foot soldiers, gunners, Marines, Navy men, cavalry, musicians, chaplains, veterinary doctors, MDs, dentists, all of these serving throughout the war. We have men who served from Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Illinois, Ohio, Delaware, Rhode Island, Colorado, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Georgia. We have regular units, we have U.S. regiments, we have the 54th Massachusetts, which is special, and we have the USCT, which is United States Colored Troops. Now we come to that date of April 17th, 1861, and I'll tell you why I chose that date. Fort Sumter was fired on by the Confederates on April 12. The Union flag came down on the 14th. One day later, on the 15th, President Lincoln called for 75,000 men for a 3-month period. Pennsylvania got the call for 16 regiments. 2 were wanted within 3 days. Many men from Luzerne County, and that's what we were then, we were not yet Lackawanna County, so from Luzerne County went off to war beginning on that date of April 17th. So within 2 days of the president's call for 75,000 men, Pennsylvania, April 17th. And a lot of our soldiers then at Forest Hill follow that date very quickly through the end of April. What year? 1861, when the war started. Early in the war, there were 18 companies from Pennsylvania and about 2,000 local men. And there were a lot of men who responded to that early call who were sent home because they were full. A lot of the local guys then turned around and paid their own way to Harrisburg, hoping that they would be able to enlist at Harrisburg. And the majority of them were turned down because the ranks were full. George J. Burkle was the first of Forest Hill's enlisting on that date of the 17th. Throughout the month, others through that month of April were George E. Allen, W.A. Beamer, Fred Bile, Abraham Bittenbender, and I'm sure that last name is ringing a bell, Robert Campbell, Charles D. Decker, Fred Emmerich, John W. Garvin, William H. Gordon, Thomas Griffith, Daniel E. Heinlein, Richard A. Hawley, John W. Jones, Joseph R. Larney, William Locker, Anthony Long, William McClave, William H. Reese, no relation, Israel Ruth, and I love that name, Israel Ruth, that sounds cool. John Reimer, John Seward, Sylvester Shively, John T. Simpson, Henry Stahl, George W. Steele, Thomas R. Thomas, Dr. Benjamin H. Troop, Ira Tripp, Isaac C. Tripp, Fred Weichel, and Levi Westfall. All of these men signed up through the month of April, and they are a part of Forest Hill. 90-day enlistments continued for the next several months, filling up quickly. After this enlistment were mostly for 3 years. Some were special call-ups, and then along the way there was, I think about a 9-month enlistment for at least one of the regiments. Some of those special call-ups along the way were for Antietam, which was in Maryland, and Gettysburg, right here in our own state. Now, the state of Pennsylvania awarded medals, and they were referred to as first defenders. And there is a picture of them, I think on that table in the back, a picture of that medal. And they were issued to all Pennsylvania soldiers, because this was only our state doing this. I don't know about other states, and we don't care about the other states. But these were issued to the soldiers who enlisted in the first 5 state regiments. And Forest Hill has some of those soldiers. Forest Hill's vets came locally from Scranton, Pittston, Providence, Blakely, and Carbondale, all who were native born from those places. Many of Forest Hill's veterans served for more than one enlistment. In fact, we have some who served in three different time periods. Sometimes they would re-enlist in the same regiment, but often it would be a re-enlistment in a different regiment. And some of them, again, were for those brief periods of only Antietam and Gettysburg. And then we have some who served almost through the entire war. Now, 2 of the regiments, the 52nd and the 132nd, were where most of our local veterans served in. So we'll kind of keep, especially the 52nd in mind as we go. The first to die that's buried at Forest Hill was Daniel S. Gardner. He died on September 17th, 1862 at Antietam. He was originally buried in Antietam National Cemetery. Then they brought him home and they reburied him in the old Pine Brook Cemetery. And then they reburied him again at Forest Hill in 1878. He had been born in 1840, thus he was only 22 years old when he died. The last veteran from the Civil War buried at Forest Hill is T.J. Foster, and T.J., or Thomas Jefferson, was the founder of the ICS, which is known today as Penn Foster. And T.J. was born in 1843, and he didn't die until October of 1936. Now, there were nationwide still a handful of veterans left at that time, but he was the oldest one in our area. Now, we have at least at Forest Hill 9 POWs. We have, and again, his last name, Abraham Bittenbender, Ed Buck, George Hine, again, Ira Tripp, James Tuthill, Evan Hughes, Henry Mott, John Jones, and Charles Metzger. Some of Forest Hill Cemetery's Civil War soldiers had also served in the war with Mexico, which was in the mid-1840s. And some of them, after the Civil War, were in the Spanish-American War in 1898. Although in the Spanish-American War, there were no local soldiers who left the States and landed in Cuba because that war was so quickly over. Now, who to talk about? I had a hard time deciding And this program, like the last one, because we're talking about a specific group, and so you have a lot to choose from, it was like, okay, who do we talk about? Who do we think about? Well, I think the first one should be the first surgeon to answer Lincoln's call to the war was Dr. Benjamin Troop, the first one from Luzerne County. He was born in New York State in 1811, and he died in June of 1897. He was the first to actually set up field hospitals. And I think that a great deal of credit over the years belongs to the citizens of Scranton. And I think this might have been the beginning of it, because he rode home to Scranton and got friends to donate cots, blankets, and all kinds of other necessary things. Dr. Troop, when he came back to Scranton, had the first hospital in Scranton, the Lackawanna Hospital, which was on Lackawanna Avenue to begin with, and then moved and became the State Hospital. And I'm sure a lot of you older people, State Hospital rings a bell. Today on that site, it's the Gino Murley Center. Now, Dr. Troop answered the call on April 23rd, 1861. With him went a father and a son, Ira Tripp, born 1814, and Ira's son, Isaac C., who was born in 1839. Both of them worked with Dr. Troop as hospital stewards in the hospital corps. Ira was captured on July 2nd, 1861, 2.5 months after enlisting, and he was killed at the Battle of Falling Waters in Maryland. He became one of the first Union prisoners to be held at Libby Prison in Virginia. He was there for 6.5 months, and he was mustered out of service on January 11, 1862. This would have been near the date of his prisoner exchange. But while at Libby, he actually made himself a suit from a blanket. That suit, as far as I know, is still, Cherry, is that still on display at the GAR Museum, Dr. Troop's suit? I'm pretty sure it's there. It was in the old museum. New museum going to Steamtown Mall, and his suit is there. And when I saw it, I was really taken aback because it looked so small. But we have to remember that the average height for a soldier in the Civil War was about 5'5", 5'6". When we see these, I came across one just recently, he's 6 foot, and like, that would be a giant to those other guys. So it's no wonder the suit looks small. Now, prior to the war, the governor of Pennsylvania, who was James Pollock at the time, had appointed Ira as an aide-de-camp on his staff as a lieutenant colonel. And so that's where we get this Colonel Ira Tripp from. His son Isaac C. also enlisted in the militia of 1862. After his first term of service and his 90 days were up, then he went in the militia of 1862, and that was the call at Fort Antietam. And that was formed briefly when the rebels were heading through Maryland, and it looked like they might get to Pennsylvania. And so extra troops were called out, and they were stopped at Antietam. So they did not reach Pennsylvania. Both Tripps had been born in Providence. Isaac died in 1882, and his son Ira, his father Ira, in 1891. Now we have 2 brothers at Forest Hill, last name Noble, spelled with a K. They came from Switzerland with their parents. They settled in New Jersey. It looks like possibly they were twins because almost the same exact date of birth is given for both of them. One was Matthias, or Matthew, and he joined a New Jersey regiment and served in that regiment for almost 2 years. After the war, he came to Scranton. Both of these brothers were carriage painters and trimmers. Brother John left New Jersey and went south, ending up in Georgia. He was there when war broke out. Ended up in a Georgia cavalry unit, serving for almost 3 years. He then left Georgia and joined his brother in Scranton. Matthias died in 1892, and John died living in Wilkes-Barre, although he had originally been in Scranton, in 1918. John and his wife had no children. One day, on a rare occasion, when a video man came, he's a freelancer for some of the stations, and he came and he talked me into going back to John Noble's lot and talking a little bit about John, and then it was on TV on a little news clip. To that point, I had always been hesitant about saying anything about our Confederate soldier because I wasn't too sure about people in the area. They have a beautiful monument on their lot, and I have never been able to come up with an identical monument to the woman who's there, high up in, I would say, life size. So I'm all pretty much convinced that that is actually John Noble's wife. And I was just so leery about somebody damaging it. But I talked about it that day, and I've talked about it since. There was a descendant of Matthew's or Matthias's who happened to hear that on television, and the next day she was in my office knocking on the door. Norma, I have something to tell you. Okay, the descendants of Matthias knew he had a brother John. They knew that he had been in the South and had fought for the Confederacy, but they had no idea what happened to him after that or where he had ended up. So they were absolutely thrilled to know that he was at Forest Hill. And the family story was that Matthias would fire into the air, not wanting to hit his brother. And I always said, what goes up must come down. John's cavalry regiment stayed pretty much around Georgia, so I don't think the brothers were ever fighting in the same vicinity. Interestingly, though, I thought, and this is where I got my first clue actually about John. When I was reading Matthias's obit, it said that he had a brother, who didn't give a name, who had been fighting for the South. John's obit very briefly mentions the fact that he was in the Civil War. Doesn't say what side he was on. Now, while we're thinking, though, about Confederates, we have two of them at Forest Hill. John is one. The other one is Edward M. Clark, who was born in Massachusetts in 1834. He was a bookbinder by trade. He seemed to me to have the wanderlust because he worked his way from Massachusetts south to Georgia, working his trade along the way. In Georgia, of all places, there we have these two men, both serving for the Confederacy, both there, we'll say almost by accident. He served for almost 3 years, and Ed's regiment did come north. He was at Gettysburg, and he was at Appomattox. Then he came to Scranton. Where did he die? Same place as the other Confederate, Wilkes-Barre of all places. And actually, they both belonged to Scranton's Odd Fellows Lodge number 291, who has a section in Forest Hill, where their members were buried for a lot of years. So here they are, both buried in this same section, and probably, here's John, and back, maybe that back wall, that's Edward. So there they are, right near one another even. I often think, what are the odds of all of that? Now, there were many veterans who are at Forest Hill who got sick or injured. Some of these who survived the war suffered from the results of either their illness or their injury for the rest of their lives. In the case at the top of the steps, there's a box with mini balls in it. Some soldiers actually carried one of them in their bodies for the rest of their lives. And if you take a look at that, you can just think to yourself, I would want to spend years living with something like that inside of me. Today they would probably think nothing of taking it out. Many more men throughout the war died from illness than from being injured or shot during the war. And then when we're thinking a little bit about those mini balls and somebody carrying one, pretty good. At Forest Hill, there's George Schrager. Born in New York in 1843, he was in the 4th Pennsylvania Cavalry. He was wounded on June 12, 1864 at Trevilian Station, and he carried that mini ball for the rest of his life from 1864 until he died in 1911. This battle with the 4th Pennsylvania Cavalry was actually the largest all-cavalry battle of the war. No foot soldiers, nobody else, just the cavalry. Now, from born in Blakely, there were 5 Hull brothers who all served in the war. 4 of the 5, John L., Aristus T., Stephen P., and William H., are all buried at Forest Hill. The 5th brother moved away. 2 of these served in the Pennsylvania 52nd, which, like I said, had a lot of local men in it, and the other 2 served for that short period of time for Gettysburg. The veteran who came the farthest to Scranton after the war was Henry C. Harrington. Now, I mean, listen to this. This is kind of mind-blowing. This man was born in Rhode Island in 1839. He ended up in Colorado, where he became the first mayor of Georgetown, Colorado, and assistant postmaster at Linville, Colorado. He served for over 3 years in the Colorado First. At this point in time, Colorado wasn't even yet a state. It was still a territory. And then somehow he ended up here in Scranton, where he died in 1907. John Wines, another soldier at Forest Hill, born in Pennsylvania in 1840. He was with Sherman on the march to the sea through Georgia. He died in 1918. We have others at Forest Hill who were on that same march and also on Sherman's march near the end of the war, coming north through the Carolinas. So our veterans fought in, they were everywhere. They fought in, I think it's safe to say, the majority of certainly the big battles, the ones that we might think are the most important. Milo J. Wilson, born in Pennsylvania in 1838, he became a lawyer. Martina, what else did he do?
He was a board of trustees at the library, one of the first.
And he died in 1898. Now we have 2 von Storch, and you're familiar with street, etc., spelled S-T-O-R-C-H. but the proper pronunciation is like the bird, von Stork with a K. But one of them was Corrington C., born in Providence in 1835. After serving for 10 months in the Pennsylvania 2nd Heavy Artillery, he was discharged with a disability. But then what did he do? He turned around and he went to Tennessee with a construction crew. He died in 1909. Now, one of our colored troop soldiers is Jackson Merriweather, and I think that's a cool name. Jackson was actually born a slave in Virginia on a plantation in 1848. He ran away from there and he became a worker for the Union Army. Now, we have to remember that during the war, there were many people, both white and black, who would attach themselves to a Union regiment, performing many odd jobs. Sometimes they got paid. If they weren't actually getting paid, they were at least given a place, something to eat and a place that they could sleep. And if you had been a slave, I'm sure, even if you had to sleep outside all the time and didn't have a whole lot of good things to eat, you still would consider yourself much better off. But in February of 1864, he officially joined a U.S. colored troop, which was the 24th. Jackson, when he came to Scranton, set himself up with a barber shop, becoming very successful and dying in 1909. And our other U.S. colored troop soldier is William Decker Giles. He too was born a slave, although the woman that he married and she became his wife, she was freeborn. William was born in Baltimore in 1836. In September of 1863, he joined the 2nd U.S. Colored Troop, dying in 1919. In less than 2 years, starting in 1863, there were almost 30 colored regiments. And a regiment was usually made up of 12 companies, with a company holding, on the average, about 100 men. So we're talking here upwards of 36,000 men, black men, who joined the Union to fight alongside their fellow white soldiers. And I know that Massachusetts actually had the 54th, which was the first black regiment that was enlisted and put into service in the North, and it always specified in the North, and then the why is another story. But that filled up so quickly that immediately they made a 55th. So there were 2 out of Massachusetts that were all black soldiers. Now remember, officers had to be white. Andrew Russell Raw, known as A.R., was born in New Jersey in 1834, and he became one of Scranton's very first undertakers, located right in the heart of the city. It was on Spruce Street. Like most of the early undertakers, he was a cabinet maker and in the furniture business, and that's how those older undertakers started out. They're in the furniture business, made cabinets, etc. Now they start making coffins. A.R. died in 1919. Smith B. Mott, born in Scranton in 1843, died in 1920. There is, you can ask, if you ask at the reference desk, and you can sit down at a table and read it. It's not available through circulation. The companies of the 52nd Regiment, Pennsylvania Volunteers. Smith wrote that book. There's a picture of Smith, military, nice looking young man, and then a very nice, distinguished, older picture of him. And any of those pictures that are out there are obtainable, or you can at least view them. at the GAR Museum. They have a few hundred pictures, which is a drop in the bucket to the number of soldiers who served in this area or who ended up in this area. And on that table over there, there's a 3-ring binder, and feel free to leaf through it, because that is Forest Hills Civil War veterans. Some of them are pictures, some of them are government tombstones, and there's some information about them. And that's kind of a work in progress, because I'm adding to it and making corrections, and then I'll get new copies from Bob Schaefer, who is with the Sons of Union Veterans. Now, the 52nd were the ones that took down the Confederate flag at Fort Sumter on April 18, 1865, and raised the Union flag on April 22nd, it being the original flag which had been flying there on the 12th of April, 1861. And this flag is now at the Fort Sumter Museum. And Martina has gotten me a picture of that flag, and I believe it's on that table. Now, one of my very favorites at Forest Hill is Corporal David E. Thompson. David was freeborn in Maryland in 1840, joined that 54th Massachusetts in May of 1863, and those were contrary to like Pennsylvania or other state regiments, or like basically local men. That 54th and the 55th, it was black men from all over, lots of states, went to Massachusetts because it was being advertised, and they were seeing these flyers, and they went to enlist in Massachusetts to become that first black Northern regiment. He joined in May of 1863. Now, the 54th, like I said, was the first black regiment formed in the North, and this regiment, again, had men from all over, and again, so quickly that they had to make a 55th. And if you ever saw the movie Glory, it's about that 54th super movie. If you never saw it, see it. And that you can take out from circulation downstairs. These men in the 54th answered the question, could black men make good soldiers? David died in 1890. The 54th Massachusetts and Pennsylvania 52nd were both at Fort Sumter at the end of the war. So when I saw that, I thought, okay, I'm going to say this is why David ended up in Scranton, because he was there and he talked to some of our local men, and Scranton's a great place to be. So he came here after the war. And then we have Edward J. Brady, who was actually born in Ireland in 1842. One night, while he was on guard duty in Washington, D.C., he stopped a man who was walking along. Who was this man? None other than the president. Realizing this, Edward started to apologize, but President Lincoln assured him that no apology was needed. He was doing his duty. The president would often visit the telegraph office at all hours, and so it was not unusual for him to be walking on the street after dark. A few years before this incident, the president had actually written a letter. There's a copy of it in one of the Bates, Pennsylvania unit volumes. I'm not sure which one, but a copy of that letter is in there. And he wrote it to the man who was the commander of Pennsylvania 150th at the time, thanking him for their duty at the White House and at the Soldiers' Retreat, where Lincoln also spent a great deal of time. So the 150th Pennsylvania must have been doing their job. right through the years. He came to Scranton, Ed did, while he was still serving in the Army during the riots of 1877, which took place a couple blocks from here. And the U.S. Army at that time sent soldiers here to kind of calm things down. While he was here, his term of enlistment was up, and he decided to stay. He was one of the organizers of the Scranton City Guard, which was formed after those riots, and he died in 1887. Now we're kind of coming to the end of the war, so that's where we get the middle part of the title for our talk is Appomattox. Okay, buried at Forest Hill, there's one Confederate, like I mentioned, Ed Clark, and there's at least 31 from Pennsylvania regiments and several from New York and New Jersey buried here who were at Appomattox. George J. Burkle, born in Germany in 1839 and died in 1904, and Darius S. Wheeler, born in Pennsylvania in 1837 and dying in 1901. Both of these men were in the 9th Pennsylvania Cavalry, and this was the last fighting, this cavalry, they did the last fighting and firing of the last guns under Sherman's command. Both of these men were discharged on July 18, 1865. Burkle had started with one of those 3-month or 90-day enlistments, but then ended up serving right through the war. And Wheeler served from November of 1861 until that date in 1865. Now, thinking a little bit about President Lincoln, at Forest Hill, and there's a picture of this man out at the top of the steps, is Philip Schweitzer. He was a musician and served from September 1861 to November 1865. He was born in Germany in 1840 and died in 1927. And Philip was a member of President Lincoln's funeral band. And then we have another man, Franklin E. Stanton, who was born in Pennsylvania in 1846 and died in 1915. He was a member of President Lincoln's Honor Guard. Stephen Mooney, born in Pennsylvania, died in 1908. When he died, he was the oldest veteran in Scranton at the time. His regiment accompanied the president's body from the Baltimore Depot in Philly to Independence Hall and remained with it while it laid in state, and then accompanied it to the depot for the train leaving to New York City. There were a few, Lincoln did not go home straight shot. There were a few cities along the way where they stopped and had viewing for the president in those cities. And then we have another soldier, Peter F. Allen, who was born in New York in 1839 and died in 1896. He was on the train that took the president home. Erastus L. Reber, born in Pennsylvania in 1847, died in 1934. After his service in the Civil War, which was for 3 years, he again entered the Army and went west to fight the Indians, serving from 1876 to 1881. And then we have a guard at Forest Hill, pictured out at the top of the steps, Norman F. Hine. He was born in Pennsylvania in 1844 and died in 1912. He was stationed at Fort Monroe, sometimes called Fortress Monroe, in Virginia when the war ended. Following the capture of Jefferson Davis, Davis was held for a time at Fort Monroe, and Norman was one of his guards. And in some of Norman's papers, he remarks in there how they all hated Davis. Some of the guards would have liked to do away with him right there on the spot. And then finally, again, one of my favorites, his picture is at the top of the steps. He became a doctor, so he's Dr. John E. O'Brien. But John was born in Ireland in 1848. At the age of only 13, he went to join his older brother, becoming the youngest telegrapher in the world for the military. Now, this was in January of 1862, and when the war was over, the War Department kept John on for another year. He was stationed at Fort Monroe, which was pretty much the center for the telegraph for the military. Here he would have met President Lincoln and many of the Union generals. Today there is a museum at that fort, which includes John. Actually, his brother had been working for Carnegie and the Pennsylvania Railroad Telegraph, and from the age of 8, he had been actually teaching John telegraphy. So here he is, this 8-year-old kid. He'd been learning it. At 10 years old, he was actually working, being paid to work for the telegraph on the Pennsylvania Railroad, and then 3 years later in the military. John also had become very good at knowing what the message was by sound, as well as from the machine itself. Very few people could operate this by sound. Even his older brother wasn't very good at it. At the start of the war, in 1861, remember John then started in 62, telegraphy itself wasn't quite 20 years old, and operating by sound was even younger. But it was this kid, an ace at it all, including repairing lines. When lines went down for one reason or another, he would have to leave the fort and go out and track that down and put up replacement lines. John was there at Fort Monroe when Davis was brought there, so I'm sure he felt like the guards, that certainly at least he didn't care for the man. When John left the service, he went to Chicago, where he attended medical school, and then taught at the medical school for a short time. He was there during the Chicago fire, and he wrote about the fire. I have the papers that he wrote it about. Coming to Scranton, he became a highly respected, knowledgeable doctor. Along the way, he had written a book, Telegraphing in Battle. This book is here at the library. John died in 1922. And thus ends our program for the night. And it is being put on YouTube. So if you want to see it again, go on YouTube. Does anybody have any comments or questions?
The balls, the mini balls that they were hit with, were those lead balls that the soldiers had them in their body for like that many years? Would they become lead poisoning from them?
No, because it wasn't. I don't think it's made of lead. There's a case out there at the table at the top of the steps. There's 2 cases in there. One has 2 pieces of artillery shell, and the other has several of those mini balls. I really don't know what they were made of, but it certainly wouldn't have, I'm sure the most was it was uncomfortable and it probably hurt. Because if it was going to do any other damage, they wouldn't have been able to carry it that long.
What was the last name of the telegrapher boy?
O'Brien.
Brian.
O'Brien. Now Actually, his brother's buried locally, but because he's not at Forest Hill, I don't talk about it. To make the list, you gotta be at Forest Hill.
The bitten vendor you mentioned, I remember hearing that a number of years ago. Where was the bitten
In
vendor?
downtown Scranton. And there were actually two brothers.
We're unemployment, across from the unemployment.
Yeah.
That's where the book.
Is that where it is?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then all the vendor.
Ah.
Was he like an industrialist or was he a lawyer?
Hardware. They have a store. Vendors keep
Whistles.
You know where whistles?
Somebody that, oh, she's just talking to them.
I have a comment. My second great grandfather was born in Providence, Scranton, 1844, and his family moved to Factoryville, and he and his three brothers joined the Civil War. And my second great grandfather served for the entire 4 years. He came out as a sergeant. He was married like about 5 times and had a million kids. Abandoned his sons. 2 of his sons ended up in that soldiers and sailors home up in Hartford.
Okay.
But his one brother, James, was he was killed at White Oak Swamp in Virginia, and he's buried in the cemetery down there. But I can't find where my second great grandfather is buried. He died in Tennessee. He was in the soldiers and sailors home in Dayton, Ohio, and then he transferred down to Mountain Home or something in Tennessee, and he died in 1912. And I contacted the state, records. They couldn't find any record of his death, so that's kind of.
Turn around and look at the record behind you. If you give her information, she'll be more than willing to help. And chances are, they'll come up with it. And one great thing about the reference department here, I can pick up the phone and whoever answers, sometimes it's something that I want them to look for there because it will only take a couple minutes. And other times I'll say, get your pencil and paper. And when I come to pick up what they have found, I will find that it's not always just the person that I gave that information to, but the whole gang of them will be involved in that. And I think that's great. So, I mean.
Well, I found most of these, I'm on Ancestry.com for like years, and I found a lot of these records on Ancestry. I didn't have to pay for it.
But the problem is with those sites that I find, like, they hold back information, and then when it comes renewal time, they'll start spewing out information that you're looking for, and it's like, oh, I gotta renew, because then they're giving you more information, so they teach you, but they don't necessarily get the information you're looking for right away until renewal time comes, and it's like, oh, okay, so.
I really haven't found that out. I mean, I have the international because I'm researching my Irish ancestors and my Hungarian ancestry and my husband's German ancestry. But I haven't found that. And then you do get information from other trees also.
Do you have the newspapers, like the newspaper.com?
I do, yeah.
Yeah, that's where I found a lot of it was from, like I was
Yeah, like I'm totally obsessed,
and so, information about different relatives, and just things weren't coming up, and then all of a sudden the renewals there, it's like, boop, 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 I was getting the whole.
Well, it depends on, they have to have somebody to put it on there, on the site.
Well, yeah, you can put the information in, and you just get all this other stuff, and I keep it listed there, and then all of a sudden, for some reason, these things started coming to
Oh, the
my
hints,
email.
yeah.
So I've often wondered that because it seems to always come around.
You have to be so careful about the information that's on there. And so many people think it's gospel because there it is, and it's not always
No.
the fact.
Well, no, I mean, but if you're taking hints off somebody else's tree, I mean, I don't just take their word for it, you know, because I found a lot of mistakes, you know.
Yeah.
Are you the curator, you're the curator at Forest Hill, right? Yeah, I went to school with Tom Price.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. We went to North Scranton together, so Tom's helped me over the years.
Good,
you know.
good, well, he's a good one to help.
Yeah, he is,
Yeah, but like I said, see Martina,
yeah.
like she needs another job.
Oh, I've used that machine there in my early stages of searching.
Okay, I guess that's it. Johnny, kick us off.